Between medical cannabis, Delta-8, and adult use cannabis, what the heck is going on in Minnesota? Well, let's get into it. Minnesota first legalized their medical cannabis back in 2014, but the medical program didn't officially launch until 2015. The Office of Medical Cannabis, which administers the medical rules and regulations, governs the medical cannabis program and is part of Minnesota's Department of Health. And the initial law only allowed for liquids, oils, and pills that are made of cannabis, including whole plant extracts and resins. And it wouldn't be until 2021 until actual flower could be consumed by medical Minnesota patients. And the licensing structure was a bit limited back then. The Commissioner of Health licensed and regulated only 2 in-state manufacturers, and only pharmacists were allowed to dispense cannabis in the retail space. And these restrictions created a lot of burden in the licensed cannabis space. So this brings me actually to Delta-8, or as I like to call it, Delta-8. And I like to call it that because of all of the confusion that Delta-8 causes between customers, patients, education, cannabis businesses versus hemp businesses. The list goes on. It's confusing, so let's dive into Delta-8 and the rise of Delta-8. So Delta-8 THC is a cannabis compound very similar in chemical structure to its cousin, Delta-9 THC, which Delta-9 is exactly that cannabinoid that we think of, or that element that we think of that is getting you high when you consume cannabis. However, Delta-8 is usually hemp extracted instead of cannabis extracted. And this hemp process with Delta-8 is a synthetic process. So there's multiple steps that have to be taken to be able to extract this Delta-8 from hemp and CBD products. So now that we're clear about Delta-8 versus Delta-9 in the THC, why is this so confusing in Minnesota specifically? Well, in Minnesota, hemp and CBD products became legal in January 2020, provided that they contain less than 0.3% of Delta-9 THC. Delta-9 here, not Delta-8, the common, abundant cannabinoid in marijuana plants that get us high. But this threshold did not apply to Delta-8 and other variations of THC because in 2020, the law specifically stated Delta-9 threshold of that THC of 0.3%. In 2022, Minnesota passed a new law that regulates the use of all cannabinoids, which includes Delta-8, which is great. But we also had 2 years of all of this confusion, and it was really challenging for the cannabis industry to compete with the hemp industry through this loophole. And the new law did not close the loophole, but instead regulated the amount of THC allowed in the products. So this means producers can continue to sell Delta-8 and can now include Delta-9 in their sales if it's derived legally from sourced hemp. Confusing, right? Which is also why defining hemp versus cannabis is a problem in itself, but that's a video for another day. Okay, now that we're clear on the history between medical cannabis and Delta-8 and how Delta-8 is made and sourced, what did Minnesota just legalize in May of 2023? So on August 2023, adults 21 and older will be able to possess in public up to 2 ounces of cannabis, and they will be allowed to cultivate up to 8 plants at home, 4 of which can be mature. The other 4 are going to be veg or teenager plants. And people can also possess up to 2 pounds of cannabis in their residence, which is really progressive compared to other cannabis laws in other states. And you're allowed to gift up to 2 ounces of cannabis without reimbursement between adults will be permitted. So essentially, as long as you're not like exchanging money and you're gifting your cannabis away, that's going to be allowed for up to 2 ounces. And even better, certain cannabis misdemeanor records will also be automatically expunged with implementation beginning in August. Actually, Minnesota is already doing this, and I recorded this video in June. And the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension will be responsible for identifying people who are eligible for relief to the courts, which will process the expungements. A newly created cannabis expungement board will also be considered, and felony cannabis offenses for relief, including potential sentence reductions for those still incarcerated. It's really great that they're making social equity really at the forefront with their adult use legalization. In addition, local governments will not be allowed to prohibit cannabis businesses from operating within their areas, though they can set quote-unquote reasonable regulations on the time of operation and location, while also limiting the number of cannabis businesses licenses based on the population size. Again, really progressive here, because if we look at things like in California, we're having a really big issue with local ordinances and local municipalities not allowing cannabis businesses. So the fact that Minnesota says that this is allowed everywhere, you just set your own local rules, is, in my opinion, phenomenal. And in addition to creating a system of licensed cannabis businesses, municipalities and counties can actually own and operate their own local government dispensaries. This is new. So we'll see how this all plays out, because I haven't seen this one happen before. And a new Office of Cannabis Management will be established. So a brand new office overseeing the cannabis community and the cannabis industry, and it will be responsible for regulating the market and issuing cannabis business licenses. There will be a designated division for social equity as well, which I absolutely love. Also, on-site consumption permits can be approved for events, and cannabis delivery services will be permitted under the new bill as well. So again, everything Minnesota is doing right now is very progressive, because some of these elements like on-site consumption permits, delivery, are elements in cannabis programs that took years to develop and implement. And so the fact that Minnesota is doing it right from the beginning, I absolutely love to see. And taxes. So there will be a gross receipt tax on cannabis sales in the amount of 10%, which will be applied in addition to the state standard 6.875% sales tax. Again, very progressive here, not a very complicated structure on who is responsible for who and what in the supply chain. So it's expected to take about 12 to 18 months for licenses to be issued and regulated sales to start, because we have to build out an entire regulatory framework. In addition, medical cannabis businesses can receive something called a combination license that would allow them to participate in the adult use market. So you're probably asking yourself, what do I do in the meantime, right? My rules aren't developed yet. My regulatory regime is not developed yet. What do I do if I want to start a cannabis business? So a couple of things to consider. One, your location. So your location, more than likely, the rules are going to say that you can't be within 1,000 feet of like a school, rehabilitation center, anything along that nature. Usually there are zoning restrictions when it comes to cannabis businesses. So first, start taking a look at that and see where you might be able to even place your cannabis business. Second, you want to start looking at your entity and your operating agreement and how you're going to form the business, because things like how you get your funding is also going to be a pretty critical element. And especially if you're getting equity raising and you are getting funding, and then in return, you are giving someone equity of your business, there's going to be rules and regulations around that, and how much equity you can give, if at all, and how much funding you can receive. And of course, there's going to be a paper trail with like your taxes and where that money came from. So be prepared for all of those elements. Next, you're going to start developing your business plan. And if you need some help developing your business plan, then just feel free to reach out to my company at info@rmcc.io. So that way we can help get you started with your business plan. And then finally, of course, you're going to need operating plans for the business during the licensing process. And those operating plans, you're going to have to cover like your security procedures, your inventory control, maybe even your HR and your employment procedures. So the earlier you can get started on this, then the easier it will be in the long term, because I promise you, you have hundreds of hours ahead of you. So if you want to learn more on how to start a cannabis business in Minnesota, then just reach out to me at info@rmcc.io, and someone from my team will get a hold of you to schedule an initial consult and help you through the licensing process. The best of luck.